The sun beats down, a relentless hammer on the cracked earth. Sarah stumbles, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, the other clutching a near-empty canteen. Dust cakes her worn dress, clings to her sweat-slicked hair, and grinds between her teeth. Each breath is a ragged gasp, each step an agony. 50 miles. 50 miles she has walked, driven by a mother's fierce, desperate love, for the medicine that might save her little Lily. The town, a cruel mirage of false hope, is days behind her now, and the precious, meager vial of laudanum she'd bartered her last silver locket for feels pitifully small against the enormity of the plains and the raging fever consuming her child back at their isolated homestead. Her vision blurs, the horizon tilting. Just a little further. She has to make it. For Lily. But the strength is ebbing from her, the unforgiving land claiming its due. From a rise, unseen, a lone rider watches. His face is weathered, unreadable, his eyes squinting against the glare. He's seen hardship, seen death, but something in the woman's solitary, faltering journey holds his gaze. She's a speck of defiance in a vast, indifferent wilderness, and she is about to break. That was a close call. Before we see how Sarah navigates this, tell us in the comments. What's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. She knows, with a chilling certainty, that she's at her limit. The medicine for Lily. It feels like a lead weight in her pocket, a testament to a journey that might end here, unfinished. Her child, her sweet, bright-eyed Lily, waiting for a mother who might never return. The thought is a fresh stab of pain, sharper than the cramping in her legs or the fire in her lungs. She sinks to her knees, the rough earth scraping her skin, a sob finally breaking free. It's then she feels it, a shadow falling over her. Terror, stark and primal, flickers through her exhaustion. She looks up, shielding her eyes, and sees him. A tall figure silhouetted against the brutal sun, a horse standing patiently behind him. He'd seen enough. With a quiet movement that spoke of long habit rather than sudden impulse, he dismounted, his shadow eclipsing her just as her body, finally surrendering, began to crumple. And with a grunt that might have been anything from effort to a muted form of concern, his strong arms were scooping her up, her world tilting into darkness as he began to carry her away from the path she could no longer tread. His name was Caleb. He lived a life pared down to essentials, a solitary existence carved out of the unforgiving landscape on a small, struggling ranch miles from any real settlement. The silence he cultivated was born of past sorrow, a quiet grief that had settled into his bones and made him a man of few words and fewer attachments. He'd lost his own wife and child to a fever years ago, a loss that had hollowed him out and driven him deeper into the embrace of the wilderness, where the silence was at least honest. He'd been checking a far fence line, a mundane task in a life filled with them, when he'd first spotted her, a distant, trudging figure that his keen eyes had initially dismissed as perhaps a lost calf or a trick of the heat haze. But as he'd drawn closer, drawn by an instinct he hadn't examined, the shape had resolved itself into that of a woman, clearly in distress, impossibly alone in this harsh expanse. Sarah, when she drifted back to a hazy awareness, found herself lying on a narrow cot, a rough blanket tucked around her. The air smelled of dust, old wood, and a faint, not unpleasant scent of horehound and leather. Her head throbbed, and a deep, aching weariness permeated her limbs. She was in a small, sparsely furnished cabin. A stone fireplace, cold now, dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs were the only other furniture besides the cot and a small chest. Through the single, grimy window, she could see the last vestiges of sunset painting the sky in bruised purples and reds. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in her brain. Lily, the medicine, where was it? Her hand flew to her pocket, fumbling. Relief, weak but potent, washed over her as her fingers closed around the small, cool glass of the vial. It was still there. The man, Caleb, sat at the table, his back to her, mending a piece of tack by the light of a flickering tallow candle. He was broad-shouldered, his movements economical and precise. He hadn't made a sound, yet she knew he was aware she was awake. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the whisper of the needle through leather and her own ragged breathing. She tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness washing over her. He spoke without turning, his voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. Best lie still. You were out for a fair spell. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. My daughter, Lily. She's sick. I have to get this medicine to her. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. He finally turned then, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable in the dim light. His eyes, though, seemed to hold a flicker of something she couldn't name, not pity, perhaps understanding, or just a weary acknowledgement of the world's harshness. He'd seen the slight bulge of her belly when he'd carried her, noted the desperation etched into her face even in unconsciousness. He knew about sick children and the lengths a parent would go to. He knew it too well. The town she'd walked from, dusty and indifferent, had offered little comfort. The doctor, a portly man with whiskey on his breath even in the morning, had glanced at her dismissively, listened to her frantic description of Lily's burning fever and rasping cough with ill-concealed impatience, and then prescribed the laudanum, more to be rid of her, she suspected, than from any real conviction it would work. It'll ease her discomfort, quiet the cough, he'd said, already turning to his next patient, a prosperous-looking rancher with a minor ailment. The apothecary had charged her a price that felt like extortion, taking the silver locket that had been her mother's. Her last tangible link to a life before grief and hardship had become her constant companions. Her husband, Tom, had been dead 6 months, taken by a runaway horse, leaving her alone with 5-year-old Lily and another on the way, on a small, hardscrabble homestead that was proving too much for one woman to manage. The neighbors were distant, wrapped in their own struggles. There had been no one else to turn to. The 50-mile trek to the nearest town, and the 50 miles back, had been her only desperate option. Caleb's cabin was a testament to his solitude. There were no feminine touches, no unnecessary adornments. Everything was functional, worn, and meticulously kept. A rifle rested on pegs above the fireplace. A few well-used tools hung by the door. His world was one of self-reliance, of wresting a meager existence from an unyielding land. He rose and ladled some water from a bucket into a tin cup, bringing it to her. His hand was calloused, steady. "Drink," he said. It wasn't a request. She drank, the cool water soothing her parched throat. Her fear of him was slowly being replaced by a profound weariness and a dawning, reluctant gratitude. He had saved her from perishing on the plains. But the urgency for Lily gnawed at her. "I need to go," she said, her voice still weak but firmer now. "My daughter." He nodded slowly. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry into her circumstances. His silence, which had initially felt threatening, now seemed almost a comfort, a space where she didn't have to explain or justify her desperation. He simply accepted it. He offered her a piece of dry jerky and a hard biscuit, which she forced herself to eat, knowing he was right. She needed strength. For Lily, and for the child growing within her, a tiny, innocent life depending on her survival. As she lay back down, the weight of the blanket a small comfort, she watched him turn back to his mending, the candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on the rough log walls. The silence returned, but it felt different now, shared, holding a fragile, unspoken truce between two strangers bound by circumstance and the harsh beauty of the land that had almost claimed her. The fear for Lily was a constant ache, but for the first time in days, a tiny sliver of hope, fragile as a newborn bird, began to flutter in her chest. She wasn't entirely alone anymore. The night passed in a haze of troubled sleep for Sarah. Dreams of Lily, fever-bright and calling for her, mingled with the disorienting reality of the strange cabin and the silent man who was her unlikely savior. Each time she startled awake, heart pounding, the steady rhythm of Caleb's breathing from a pallet on the far side of the small room was a strange reassurance. He had given her the only cot, a gesture of rough courtesy that she hadn't expected. When dawn finally broke, painting the small window with pale gray light, Caleb was already up, tending a small fire in the hearth. The aroma of weak coffee and something like cornmeal porridge filled the cabin. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet competence that spoke of long habit. Sarah pushed herself up, feeling a little stronger, though her muscles screamed in protest. The dizziness was less severe. "Lily," she said, the name a prayer and a spur. "I have to get to her." Caleb turned from the fire, a tin plate of the steaming porridge in his hand. He gestured with his chin towards it. "Eat first." She took the plate, her hands trembling slightly. The porridge was bland but warm, and she ate it slowly, feeling the meager sustenance spread through her. "The medicine I got," she began, her voice hesitant. "It's laudanum, the doctor said." Caleb listened, his expression unchanging, as she recounted the brief, unsatisfactory consultation. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring into the fledgling flames. "Laudanum might quiet a cough, dull pain," he said finally, his voice still low and even. "But for a high fever, a child's fever, it's not enough. Might do more harm than good if the dose ain't right." Sarah's blood ran cold. The doctor's indifference, his haste, had he prescribed something useless or even dangerous? The fragile hope she had nurtured overnight shriveled. What else can be done?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a renewed fear. Caleb considered. "There's a willow bark tea good for fevers, and other simples. But if it's lung fever like you described her cough, she might need something stronger. Something the town doctor wouldn't think of for someone without means." He didn't say a poor widow, but the implication hung in the air. He remembered the town doctor, a man more interested in his bottle and the fees from wealthy ranchers than in practicing careful medicine. He also knew of an old woman, a recluse some called a healer and others a witch, who lived on the outskirts of that same town, whose knowledge of herbs and remedies far surpassed the doctor's. But seeking her out was not something most folks did. Sarah's face crumpled. I don't have anything else to trade. That locket was all I had left." Caleb looked at her then, truly looked at her, at the desperation in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands, the almost translucent quality of her skin stretched taut over her cheekbones. He saw not just a woman in need, but a reflection of his own past helplessness in the face of illness. His intervention on the plains had been an act of basic humanity. This now felt like something more, a responsibility, perhaps, a chance, however small, to fight back against the relentless tide of loss that had once drowned him. "I'll go to town," he said, the words simple, yet carrying an immense weight. There might be something else to be had." Sarah stared at him, astonished. "You? But why? You don't even know me." He shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his shoulders. "Child's sick. Needs medicine." He rose and went to the pegs by the door, taking down a worn saddlebag. "You stay here. Rest. Keep the fire going. There's water in the bucket, some dried meat." Fear warred with a desperate, burgeoning trust in Sarah. To be left alone again, even in the relative safety of the cabin, was a frightening prospect. "Didn't ask you to ask." He glanced back at her, a fleeting look that held no artifice, only a quiet determination. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Sarah listened to the sounds of him saddling his horse, the jingle of harness, the soft snort of the animal. Then, the rhythmic beat of hooves, fading into the distance. She was alone again, in a stranger's cabin, with her fate and Lily's, resting on the improbable charity of a silent cowboy. She slowly got up and, as he'd instructed, slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. The small cabin felt suddenly very empty, and the silence now was not comforting, but filled with the anxious ticking of passing time and the weight of an immeasurable debt. The hours stretched before Sarah, long and empty, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire she dutifully tended and the frantic thumping of her own heart. She moved about the small cabin, her earlier weakness giving way to a restless energy fueled by anxiety. She examined Caleb's few possessions, not out of snooping curiosity, but in an attempt to understand the man who had so unexpectedly altered the course of her desperate journey. There wasn't much to see. A couple of worn tin plates and cups, a single cast iron pot, a neatly folded spare blanket identical to the one she had used. On a small, crudely made shelf near his pallet, there was a single book, its cover worn smooth, the title faded beyond recognition. She picked it up. It fell open to a page creased from many readings, a passage about the changing seasons, about endurance. Seemed fitting. There were no pictures, no mementos of a past life, save for a small, intricately carved wooden bird, no bigger than her thumb, tucked away in the corner of the shelf. It was beautifully made, detailed with a skill that surprised her. A flicker of another life, another Caleb, perhaps? She touched it gently, wondering about the hands that had shaped it, before placing it carefully back. His life was a study in stark simplicity, yet in that simplicity, there was a sense of order, of resilience. He was a man who knew how to survive, how to endure. She prayed he also knew how to succeed in this mission he had undertaken for a stranger. Meanwhile, Caleb rode with a steady, ground-eating pace. The sun climbed higher, beating down on him, but he was inured to it. His thoughts were not on his own discomfort, but on the woman back at his cabin and the sick child she spoke of with such raw pain in her voice. He too had known that pain, the gnawing fear, the desperate hope. He pushed the memories down, focusing on the task at hand. The town was a good half-day's ride, and he aimed to be there and back before nightfall if possible, though he knew that was optimistic. He skirted the main track, preferring the less-traveled paths he knew. He wasn't a man who sought company. When he reached the outskirts of the small, dusty settlement, he didn't head straight for the doctor's office or the apothecary. Instead, he guided his horse towards a dilapidated shack set back from the road, half hidden by a tangle of overgrown bushes and gnarled trees. Smoke curled lazily from its crooked chimney. This was where Martha, the old herb woman, lived. He dismounted, tying his horse to a low-hanging branch. He approached the door and knocked. After a moment, it creaked open, and a woman with eyes as sharp and knowing as a hawk's peered out. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her hair a wild silver mane. "Caleb," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Didn't expect to see you. What trouble brings you?" She knew most who came to her door were driven by trouble of one kind or another. "Looking for a remedy, Martha," he said, his voice quiet. "For a child. High fever, bad cough. Lung fever. Sounds like." Martha's gaze sharpened further. She studied him for a long moment. "Child of yours?" He shook his head.
"No."
"Belongs to a woman. Found her on the plains. She walked from here, trying to get medicine for the girl." Martha grunted. "The doctor likely gave her laudanum and sent her packing. It wasn't a question." Caleb nodded. "Fool," Martha muttered. Whether referring to the doctor or the situation, Caleb couldn't tell. "Coméine." Her cabin was cluttered but surprisingly clean, filled with the pungent, earthy aroma of drying herbs hanging in bunches from the rafters. Jars of various concoctions lined the shelves. She moved with a surprising agility for her age, gathering a few items, dried leaves, roots, a small vial of dark liquid. "This is a strong brew for the fever," she said, handing him a packet of dried herbs. Steep it well. Small sips for the child. And this, she gave him the vial. For the cough to help clear the lungs. Use sparingly. It's potent. Caleb reached into his pocket for the few coins he carried. Martha waved his hand away. No charge for a child's life, Caleb. Not for you anyway. You've shown kindness to me in the past when others wouldn't. She was referring to the times he'd brought her firewood or a share of a kill when he knew she was low. Just see it gets to the child. And the mother. She sounds like she's been through the ringer. She has, Caleb confirmed. This journey of yours, it's a kindness, Martha said, her sharp eyes softer now. The world needs more of it. Caleb merely nodded, taking the remedies. Obliged, Martha. Go on then. Don't tarry. As he rode away from Martha's shack, Caleb felt a sliver of hope. These remedies felt more real, more potent than the laudanum Sarah clutched. He cut through the edge of town, needing one more thing, a little proper food, if he could get it without drawing too much attention. He stopped at the general store, a place he usually avoided. The storekeeper, a balding man named Silas, eyed him with the usual mixture of curiosity and caution reserved for solitary men like Caleb. Need some flour, coffee, Caleb said, keeping his list short. And maybe some tinned milk if you have it for the child, he thought, or even for Sarah. As Silas was measuring out the flour, a woman entered the store, her voice sharp and carrying. It was Mrs. Henderson, the town's foremost gossip. And I tell you, Silas, it was that widow, Sarah Miller, the one whose husband, Tom, got himself killed so foolishly. Heard she up and left her little girl, sick as she was, and took off. Some say she was heading for the mining camps, looking for a new man already. Caleb's jaw tightened. He kept his back to the woman, but her words were like barbs. So that was Sarah's name, Miller. And this was the kind of careless cruelty she faced. Silas clucked sympathetically, though his eyes gleamed with interest. Terrible, terrible. Leaving a sick child. Caleb turned then, his eyes cold. He didn't say anything, just met Silas's gaze. Then Mrs. Henderson's. The woman faltered under his silent scrutiny, a faint flush rising on her neck. She hadn't expected the quiet man at the counter to react at all. He paid for his goods, his silence more eloquent than any outburst. As he left the store, he heard Mrs. Henderson's voice resume, somewhat subdued but still persistent. He knew Sarah's story, or at least the town's twisted version of it, would be all over by nightfall. His intervention, if it became known, would only add fuel to the fire. It didn't matter. All that mattered was getting back to the cabin, to Sarah, and then, somehow, getting this medicine to her child. His resolve hardened. He'd seen enough of judgment and hardship. Today, he was on the side of mercy. Back in Caleb's cabin, Sarah's anxiety grew with each passing hour. The sun arced across the sky, then began its slow descent, painting the small window with hues of orange and deepening purple. Every creak of the cabin walls, every rustle of wind outside, made her jump. What if he didn't come back? What if something had happened to him? Or what if he'd simply decided she wasn't worth the trouble? The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. She paced the small space, her shadow stretching long and distorted in the fading light. She tried to pray, but her thoughts were too scattered, too consumed by fear for Lily and this new, uncertain dependence on a man she barely knew. She ate a little of the dried meat Caleb had left, forcing it down, knowing she needed to keep her strength up, not just for herself and the baby she carried, but for if he returned. She imagined Lily, small and frail in her little bed, her breathing shallow, her skin hot to the touch. The image was a torment, spurring her restlessness. Just as true darkness began to settle, and her hope had dwindled to a tiny, flickering ember, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of a horse approaching. Her heart leaped into her throat. She rushed to the small window, peering out, but could see little in the gloom. The barred door felt like a prison wall. Then a soft knock. Sarah? His voice. Caleb's voice. Relief washed over her in a wave so potent it left her weak-kneed. She fumbled with the heavy bar, her hands shaking, and pulled the door open. He stood there, weary and dust-covered, his horse blowing softly behind him. In the faint light spilling from the cabin, his face looked drawn, but his eyes met hers with a steady reassurance. He held out a small cloth bundle and a vial. "Martha sends these," he said, "for the fever and the cough." Sarah reached for them, her fingers brushing his. A jolt, like a spark from the fire, passed between them. "Martha, an old woman, knows herbs," he explained briefly. He stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of the trail and a profound sense of relief. He unslung his saddlebag, placing the flour, coffee, and the precious can of milk on the table. She said there was no charge. "For a child's life," Sarah murmured, looking at the remedies in her hand, tears welling in her eyes. Such kindness from strangers. Caleb nodded, already moving to tend to his horse. He didn't speak of what he'd overheard in town, of the careless gossip. He didn't need to add to her burdens. Sarah watched him, her heart too full for words. He had done this for her, for Lily. He had faced the town, sought out help, and returned. She looked at the simple remedies in her hand, then at the can of milk, a luxury she hadn't been able to afford in months. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "Thank you, Caleb." He merely grunted in acknowledgement, but as he turned from stowing his gear, their eyes met again, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something in his gaze that went beyond duty or pity. A shared understanding, perhaps, of the fragility of life and the unexpected strength found in connection. The immediate crisis of medicine had been addressed, but a new, unspoken tension filled the small cabin. They were two strangers, thrown together by fate, bound by a shared purpose. The journey was not yet over. Lily was still miles away, and Sarah was still weak, though stronger than before. A storm was brewing outside too. The wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves of the cabin, and the sky had grown heavy and dark. They were, it seemed, trapped together, at least for a while longer, in this small sanctuary against the vast, indifferent wilderness and the storm that was about to break. The silence that fell between them now was different again, less the silence of strangers, and more the quiet anticipation of what lay ahead, a path they would somehow have to navigate together. The storm broke with a vengeance just as Caleb finished tending to his horse and secured the cabin for the night. Wind howled like a banshee around the small dwelling, rattling the single window in its frame and sending flurries of old dust down from the rafters. Rain lashed against the logs, a relentless drumming that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small structure. Inside, the fire in the hearth blazed brightly, a defiant beacon against the tempestuous night. Caleb brewed coffee, strong and black, and Sarah, huddled near the warmth, watched him. The simple domesticity of the act, the shared shelter against the storm's fury, created an unexpected intimacy. They were isolated, cocooned together in this small bubble of light and warmth, the wild world raging just beyond their walls. "We won't be going anywhere for a while," Caleb stated, handing her a steaming tin cup of coffee. It was more an observation than a complaint. Sarah nodded, cradling the warm cup in her hands. "Lily, I hope she's all right. My neighbor, Mrs. Albright, promised to look in on her, but she's old, and her own health isn't good." The worry was a constant ache in her heart. Caleb sat on the other chair by the table, sipping his own coffee. The silence stretched, but it was no longer strained. It was a silence filled with the storm's roar and their own unspoken thoughts. Finally, Sarah broke it, her voice soft. "Why did you help me, Caleb? First on the plains and now this going to town for the medicine. You didn't have to." He stared into the fire for a long moment, the flames reflecting in his dark, unreadable eyes. When he finally spoke, His voice was low, laced with an old pain. "I had a wife," he said, the words stark in the small cabin. "And a daughter. Little girl, 'bout your Lily's age, I reckon. Fever took 'em both. Years ago now." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The casual cruelty of life, the shared landscape of grief. She hadn't imagined. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." He shrugged, a gesture that tried to dismiss the weight of his words but failed. Wasn't anything to be done. Not then. Doctor was useless. Stood by and watched him fade. His hands clenched briefly around his cup. "Saw you out there. Reminded me. Didn't want to see another child lost if there was a way to help." The revelation hung in the air, heavy and profound. His silence, his solitude, his unexpected kindness. It all began to make a painful kind of sense. He wasn't just a stoic cowboy. He was a man acquainted with deep sorrow, a man who understood loss in a way few could. "My Tom," Sarah found herself saying, the words tumbling out. "He was a good man, strong, kind. We were building a life. And then that horse. It all happened so fast." She pressed a hand to her belly. "This little one will never know its father." Tears streamed down her face, unchecked. She hadn't spoken of her grief so openly to anyone. There had been no one to speak to. But here, in this storm-lashed cabin, with this silent man who understood the language of loss, the words came. Caleb didn't offer platitudes or empty comforts. He simply sat there, his presence a quiet anchor in her storm of sorrow. He let her weep, his own gaze fixed on the fire, his face etched with a shared understanding. When her tears finally subsided, a fragile sense of peace settled over her. She felt lighter, as if a great burden had been shared, even if only in the telling. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick, "for listening." He nodded. "Sometimes," he said, his voice rough, "just speaking it helps." The storm raged on through the night, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The walls between them, built of caution and circumstance, had begun to crumble. They were no longer just a rescuer and a victim, but two souls who had glimpsed the hidden wounds in each other. The immediate, pressing concern now was Lily. The medicine Caleb had brought offered hope, but it needed to reach her. And Sarah knew, with a mother's instinct, that every passing hour was critical. "As soon as this storm breaks," she said, her voice filled with a new resolve, "we have to try and get to my homestead. I need to get this medicine to Lily." Caleb looked at her. She was still pale, still bearing the marks of her ordeal and her pregnancy. But there was a fire in her eyes now, a fierce determination that mirrored his own quiet resolve. "It's rough country between here and there, I reckon," he said, "especially after a storm like this. Creeks will be swollen, ground muddy." "I know," Sarah said, "but I have to try. Lily is. She's all I have left of him. Of us." Caleb nodded slowly. He understood that kind of desperation, that fierce, protective love. He knew the risks. The journey would be perilous, especially for a woman in her condition, even with his help. But looking at her, at the raw courage shining through her fear, he also knew they had to try. "When the storm passes," he said, his voice a quiet vow, "we'll go. I'll get you and this medicine to your girl." They began to plan, their voices low against the continued roar of the wind and rain. Sarah described the location of her homestead, the landmarks, the easiest paths she knew, though easy was a relative term in this rugged land. Caleb listened intently, asking occasional, pertinent questions, his mind already mapping the route, assessing the potential dangers. How would they transport her if she faltered? What supplies would they need? The nearest crossing over Bitter Creek. Would it be passable after this deluge? The decision was made. Their individual struggles had merged into a shared one. The showdown wouldn't be with a villain brandishing a gun, but with the raw, untamed elements, with distance, with dwindling time, and with the fragility of life itself. Caleb had offered her shelter from the storm, but now he was offering more. His strength, his knowledge of the land, his unwavering commitment to see her safely reunited with her child. He would stand with her against whatever the journey threw their way. It was a silent promise, made in the heart of a storm, that bound them together more tightly than any spoken oath. The storm finally abated just before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening, but also treacherous. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Rivers and creeks, normally placid, would now be rushing torrents, the ground sodden and slick. Caleb was already moving, checking his gear, saddling his sturdy gelding. Buck. He packed a small sack with the provisions he'd bought in town, adding some jerky and hardtack from his own meager stores. He also included the precious remedies from Martha. Sarah watched him, a knot of anxiety and anticipation tightening in her chest. She felt stronger than she had in days, fueled by a desperate hope and the coffee Caleb had made, but she knew her limits. The journey ahead would test them severely. "Are you sure you're up to this?" Caleb asked, his gaze lingering on her face, noting the lingering shadows under her eyes, but also the determined set of her jaw. "I have to be," Sarah said simply. "For Lily." He nodded. He had fashioned a makeshift pillion for her on Buck, a rolled blanket strapped behind the saddle. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it was the best he could do. Leading his horse, he helped her mount. She settled herself, clutching the sack with the medicines tightly. The weight of the child within her felt more pronounced now, a constant reminder of her vulnerability, but also of the new life she fought to protect, alongside Lily. "Hold tight," Caleb said, swinging himself easily into the saddle. Their journey began. The land, freshly scoured by the storm, was beautiful in its ruggedness, but also perilous. The path Sarah usually took was, in places, washed away or turned into a quagmire. Caleb, with his innate knowledge of the terrain, often had to find new routes, picking his way carefully through thickets of rain-heavy brush or along the unstable edges of newly formed gullies. Progress was slow, agonizingly so. Several times, Buck slipped on the slick mud, his powerful muscles straining to keep his footing. Caleb remained calm, his voice low and steady as he soothed the horse, his hands firm on the reins. Sarah clung on, her knuckles white, her body aching with each jolt and sway. She tried to keep her fear in check, focusing on the image of Lily, on the hope that Martha's remedies would work. The first major obstacle was Bitter Creek. Normally a shallow stream they could easily ford, it was now a churning, muddy torrent, swollen to twice its usual size, carrying debris from upstream. The usual crossing point was completely submerged, the current dangerously strong. Caleb dismounted, studying the raging water, his expression grim. "Can't cross here," he said. "Too risky." Sarah's heart sank. "Is there another way?" "Further upstream, there's a place where the banks are higher, the channel narrower. Might be a fallen log, or a place we can swim Buck across if we have to. It'll add miles to the journey." Miles they could ill afford, but there was no choice. They turned upstream, fighting their way through dense undergrowth along the creek bank. The air was thick with the roar of the water. Sarah felt a wave of despair. Each delay felt like a betrayal of Lily. Caleb, sensing her distress, paused. "We'll get through," he said, his voice firm, though his face was taut with effort. He reached back, his calloused hand briefly covering hers where she gripped the saddle horn. A small gesture, but it sent a surge of warmth and renewed determination through her. They found a spot eventually, a place where a large cottonwood had fallen across the creek years ago, its massive trunk now half submerged, but still offering a precarious bridge. It was slick with moss and rain. "I'll take Buck across first," Caleb decided. "Then I'll come back for you." Sarah watched, her heart in her mouth, as Caleb carefully led Buck into the churning water beside the log. The horse snorted, eyes wide, but trusted Caleb's lead. They fought the current, water swirling around Buck's chest, Caleb waiting beside him, holding the reins tight, his body braced against the force of the water. It seemed an eternity before they reached the other side, scrambling up the muddy bank. Then it was Sarah's turn. The log looked terrifyingly narrow and slippery. Caleb made his way back across it with a sureness of foot that belied the danger. He reached her side, his hand outstretched. "Give me the medicines first," he said. He carefully stowed the precious packet and vial inside his shirt. "Now hold on to me. Don't look down." Sarah took his hand. It was strong, steady. She focused on his face, on the quiet confidence in his eyes, and stepped onto the log. It was like walking a tightrope. The water roared beneath them, seeming to pull at her. She stumbled once, a small cry escaping her lips, but Caleb's grip tightened, holding her fast. He didn't speak, just guided her, step by slow, deliberate step. When they finally reached the other side, her legs were trembling so violently she could barely stand. Caleb helped her to a dry patch of ground. "Rest a moment," he said, his voice a little breathless. She leaned against a tree, gasping for air, her relief so profound it was physically painful. He had saved her again, risked himself for her. She looked at him, truly looked at him, at the lines of weariness around his eyes, the mud stains on his clothes, the quiet strength that radiated from him. He was more than just a silent cowboy. He was a good man, a truly good man. The rest of the journey was a blur of hardship. They navigated treacherous slopes, pushed through tangled wilderness, always with the urgency for Lily driving them onward. Sarah, despite her exhaustion and the constant discomfort of her pregnancy, found a reserve of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She thought of Lily's small, trusting face, of the feel of her daughter's hand in hers. She thought of Tom and the life they had dreamed of. And she thought of Caleb, this quiet, steadfast man who had shouldered her burdens as if they were his own. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, Sarah recognized a familiar landmark, a uniquely shaped rock formation she called the Sleeping Bear. "We're close," she said, her voice hoarse with emotion and fatigue. "My homestead, it's just beyond that rise." A new energy seemed to flow into them. Caleb urged Buck forward, his face set. As they crested the rise, Sarah saw it, the small, weathered cabin, the straggling fence line, the smokeless chimney. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and dread. Old Mrs. Albright was sitting on the porch steps, her face etched with worry. She looked up as they approached, her eyes widening in surprise, then immense relief. "Sarah, child, I was so worried. And Lily, she's been asking for you. Her fever, it's been so high." Sarah practically fell from the horse, Caleb catching her before she could stumble. "The medicine," she gasped. "Lily." She didn't wait, rushing into the cabin, Caleb and Mrs. Albright close behind. Lily lay in her small cot, her face flushed, her breathing shallow and rasping. Her eyes were closed, her small form unnervingly still. "Lily Bug," Sarah whispered, sinking to her knees beside the cot, her hand flying to her daughter's forehead. It was burning hot. Caleb was already there, opening the packet of Martha's herbs, his movements swift and sure. Mrs. Albright hurried to fetch some warm water. "Small sips," Caleb instructed, as Sarah gently raised Lily's head, trying to coax a little of the brewed tea between her parched lips. Lily whimpered, stirring slightly, but swallowed a little. Then, Caleb carefully administered a tiny amount of the dark liquid from the vial for her cough. They waited, an agony of suspense. Sarah held Lily's small, hot hand, murmuring soft words of love and reassurance, her tears falling onto the rough blanket. Caleb stood by, a silent, watchful presence, his gaze fixed on the child. Mrs. Albright hovered nearby, wringing her hands. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lily's breathing seemed to ease a little. The harsh, rasping quality lessened. A tiny sigh escaped her lips. Sarah looked up at Caleb, her eyes wide with a fragile, dawning hope. He met her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his own, then nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a start. They had made it. Against the odds, against the fury of the elements and the cruelty of distance, they had brought the medicine home. Caleb had carried her, not just physically over the plains, but metaphorically, through despair and danger. And in reaching Lily, in this small, battered cabin, with the life of a child hanging in the balance, something profound had been forged between them, a bond of shared struggle, of quiet courage, and of a deep, unspoken care. The true test of the medicine, and of Lily's strength, was yet to come, but for now, in this moment of fragile hope, Sarah knew she was no longer alone in her fight. The hours that followed were a vigil of quiet intensity. Sarah, Caleb, and Mrs. Albright took turns sponging Lily's forehead with cool water, coaxing tiny sips of Martha's brew and the fever tea into her. The small cabin was filled with the low murmur of their voices, the scent of herbs, and the palpable weight of their shared hope. Caleb, surprisingly gentle for such a rugged man, showed a quiet competence in caring for the child, his large hands surprisingly deft as he helped adjust Lily's blankets or supported her small head. Sarah watched him, her heart aching with a gratitude so profound it felt like a physical presence. He hadn't hesitated, hadn't questioned. He had simply acted, with a quiet strength and a deep well of compassion she was only now beginning to comprehend. He had faced the wilderness, her own despair, and now this fragile fight for Lily's life, all for people who were, until a few days ago, strangers to him. As night deepened, Mrs. Albright, exhausted, finally retired to her own nearby cottage, promising to return at first light. Sarah and Caleb remained, sharing the watch. Lily's fever still burned, but her breathing was definitely easier, the terrible rasping cough less frequent. She slept more restfully, her small face, though still flushed, looking less strained. In the quiet companionship of the flickering lamplight, a sense of peace, fragile but real, settled in the small room. Sarah found herself mending a tear in Caleb's worn shirt, her fingers moving automatically, the simple task a comfort. He sat across the small table, cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical movements, though his gaze often drifted to the sleeping child. "She seems a little better," Sarah whispered, not daring to hope too much. Caleb nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "The herbs are good. Martha knows her craft. But Lily, she's a fighter. Like her mother." A faint blush rose on Sarah's cheeks at his quiet words. She thought of the journey, of her own moments of despair and terror, and the unwavering strength he had shown. "I wouldn't have made it without you, Caleb. Not across the plains. Not through that storm. Not any of it." He shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise. "You would have found a way. You were already walking 50 miles. But you carried me," she insisted softly. "When I couldn't walk anymore. You carried me home." He looked at her then, a long, searching look. The lamplight softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Reckon we carried each other in a way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The unspoken truth of his words hung in the air between them. He had saved her, yes, but in doing so, in caring for her and for Lily, something had reawakened in him too. A sense of purpose, perhaps. A connection to life that he had thought long dead and buried with his own wife and child. Towards dawn, Lily's fever finally broke. Sarah felt it the moment she laid her hand on her daughter's forehead. The burning heat had lessened, replaced by a gentle warmth and a light sheen of perspiration. Lily stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. "Mama?" she whispered, her voice weak but clear. Sarah's heart soared. "I'm here, my darling. I'm right here." Tears of relief streamed down her face as she gathered Lily into her arms, holding her close. Caleb stood by, a silent witness to their reunion, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his lips. He had seen so much loss, so much sorrow. To witness this moment of tender reunion, this victory over the encroaching darkness, was a balm to his old wounds. In the days that followed, Lily slowly regained her strength. Caleb stayed, his presence a quiet comfort and an invaluable help. He chopped firewood, mended the broken fence rail that Tom had never gotten to, repaired the leaky roof on the small barn. He moved about the homestead with a quiet efficiency, never asking for anything, simply seeing what needed to be done and doing it. He spoke little, as always, but his actions spoke volumes. Sarah, her own strength returning, found herself cooking for him, mending his clothes, falling into a domestic rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. She watched him with Lily, saw the gentle way he spoke to the child, the way Lily, initially shy, began to follow him around, chattering at him, his quiet presence seeming not to daunt her youthful exuberance. He would listen patiently, occasionally offering a gruff but kind response, or even carving her a small, whimsical animal from a piece of scrap wood with the same knife he used for skinning game. The small cabin, once a place of grief and hardship for Sarah, began to feel different, felt warmer, safer, felt like a home again. The shadows of her loss were still there, but they were no longer all-consuming. Caleb's presence had brought a quiet light into their lives. One evening, as Sarah watched Caleb showing Lily how to whittle a piece of soft pine into a surprisingly recognizable horse, a deep sense of peace settled over her. The journey had been brutal, the fear overwhelming, but they had endured. They had found strength in each other. Caleb looked up, catching her gaze. He didn't say anything, but his eyes held a question, a quiet hope. He had carried her home, expecting to return to his solitary life. But now leaving felt wrong, unfinished. Sarah smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her face. "The stew's almost ready," she said. "Are you hungry?" It wasn't a declaration, not a promise of forever, but it was an invitation, an acceptance, a beginning. He had walked into her life out of the desolate plains, a silent, enigmatic stranger. He had carried her when she was broken, sheltered her from the storm, and helped save her child. In doing so, he had not just brought her home. He had, perhaps, found his own. He watched her as she turned back to the hearth, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek, the gentle swell of her belly a promise of new life. And Caleb knew, with a quiet certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his solitary journey was finally over. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.